Welcome everyone to The Burning Archive. My name's Jeff Rich, and The Burning Archive is a podcast about all things history and culture, and I thought I'd do a special edition of the podcast on the situation in Ukraine. Obviously, the world's attention has focused over the last, 2 days, but more than that, several months really, around the security situation in Europe, particularly around Ukraine, and that reached a high point 2 days ago now, when Russia launched what appears to be something of a blitzkrieg but precise invasion of Ukraine. And as I am speaking to you today in Melbourne, Australia, safe, we think, from nuclear attack or World War III or whatever, I can certainly see that there are press reports going out of the American government offering to evacuate Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to evacuate him from Kiev, but he has said that he wishes to not accept that American offer to sort of bail out, but to actually stay in Kiev. And good on him for refusing that offer, if indeed that report is true. So it's been an astonishing couple of days. To some degree, I've been avoiding the Australian newspapers because, I just don't have a great opinion of the quality of journalism today. But certainly the front page of the Australian, the one national newspaper in Australia, said that its headline was "Echoes of World War II." And I've certainly spoken to colleagues and other people concerned about whether we're entering into some sort of World War III or global war type situation, and there's even been talk about use of nuclear weapons. So I thought I'd just get my thoughts down, not in writing but in audio files, about the situation in Ukraine and what it means. For one of the big themes, I guess, I've spoken about a bit on the Burning Archive podcast, which is the whole theme of empires, rivalry between empires, the emergence of a multipolar world, and the crumbling collapse, decline of the American empire. And I feel it's pretty uncertain exactly how things are going to turn out. It's barely 48 hours. I think it's 52 hours maybe since this whole situation blew up. As in the decision by Vladimir Putin of Russia, President of Russia, to order a special military operation. I'm just going to use the terms the various governments are using rather than put particular labels on them. And things have progressed a fair bit in those 2 days. And it's a bit scary, it's a bit troubling, but it's also, I think, we're really in the midst of an extraordinary information war from all sides. And some of the more sensible voices in the world, I think, are really not coming from the Western world. They're coming from places like India and Kenya, who are sort of urging a path of quiet diplomacy. Hard to see that right at the moment, but I suspect we might be back on that track before too long. But it's interesting that this whole theme has echoed something I said in my year in review podcast back in December. So I'm just going to play a little bit of that just to set the scene before I talk about the events over the last few days. Well, there are some very interesting treaties or diplomatic developments during the year. And in a way, I think in 2021, I think we will have seen the beginning of the diplomatic process or events that will lead to the treaties to end what I've begun to think of as the 100 years Cold War. So there are all these treaties that have really, I think, changed the state of play of diplomatic international system over the last year. And you, if you're a listener in Australia, you might be thinking, well, this must be the new arrangement Australia made with the United States and the United Kingdom, AUKUS, I think it was called, to provide Australia with access to nuclear submarines. Or you, if you're an American or sympathetic to Joe Biden, you might be thinking it was Joe Biden's declaration that at the start of the year that America is back. But no, I think perhaps these treaties are best represented by the documents issued by Russia to both NATO and to the United States in December this year, 2021, that basically set out a series of demands for a genuine international system of law brokered through the United Nations, not through the international rules-based order, and that called for the end to eastward expansion of NATO and effectively the end of the Cold War. Now, the Cold War, one remembers, ended in, one thinks ended in 1989 with the triumph of the United States and the beginning of the unipolar moment. But in truth, that Cold War ended without a real negotiated peace. Infamously, the American negotiators, James Baker, who was then the sort of Secretary of State, I think, for George H.W. Bush, so the elder President Bush, proposed to Mikhail Gorbachev that if Gorbachev and the Soviet Union left East Germany and the communist states of Eastern Europe without any conflict or any trouble, so to speak, then America would agree that NATO would move not 1 inch further eastward towards Russia, and so provide a clear, boundary and security for Russia's border. And that was a promise that America did not keep, because America actually, under Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, and all the others, have actually pursued a fairly aggressive policy of eastward expansion of NATO. And it is this that the Russian treaty is formally bringing to an end. And in a way, I call it the 100-year Cold War, because I think in many ways this conflict between East and West, between the Anglo-American world and Russia, really does date back to 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution of that year. And although there was, I guess, a brief period during World War II where Russia allied with the Anglo-American world to push back Germany out of its own country, on the whole, there have been various levels of geopolitical rivalry between the Anglo-American world and Russia since then. And now, with Russia more closely allied with China, I think there's a far more confident and assertive alliance, I guess, between China and Russia that is forcing the hand to bring a formal treaty to end that conflict. I do hope it doesn't lead to another military conflict, and I certainly hope it doesn't lead to the bifurcation of the world, because I would rather miss travelling to Russia, to some degree China as well, but certainly would miss having close cultural connections with Russia. But hopefully the statespeople of the world will see sense and negotiate a treaty to end this long and unproductive conflict. And there was a book I did read through the year by, I think, a Norwegian author, Arne Wested, which is a history of the Cold War. And he similarly describes the Cold War as actually of a longer duration than just, post-World War II to 1989. It really does date back to that sort of ideological cleavage at the start of the 20th century that was also reflected in a geopolitical strategic cleavage between the Anglo-American and Eurasian worlds. But I think we have begun to see the beginning of the end of that long, long war. So I guess what I was saying in that podcast, and just as a little editorial note I should add, I took a bit of a break in recording, so I'm now recording this on Sunday the 27th of February. What I was saying in that podcast was that the emergence of a multipolar world is really forcing a negotiated peace settlement of what I described as 100 years Cold War, or at least mostly Cold War. And it is, for all peace-loving, tolerant people, it is regrettable, but also realistic to say that unfortunately war often precedes peace, and the events in Ukraine appear to be perhaps the first of a series of events in the last stage of that long war. So I feel, especially for us in the outer reaches of the Anglo-American Empire, we are in for some difficult few years, as I fear events are going to spiral a bit out of control. One sincerely hopes not, but it is looking, as I speak today, that America and the England and the EU and even Australia, I think, have sort of agreed to sanctions to disconnect at least part of Russia's financial system from the sort of financial messaging service SWIFT, and this could have a dramatic escalation, and not necessarily a very effective strategy, also one that may cause as much harm to the West as it does, and in particular to the American financial system and the reserve currency of the dollar, as it does to Russia. Anyhow, So I think we're going to have a few difficult years ahead of ourselves, and I think I might be making some regular comments on the podcast, perhaps just to sort of make sense of this unfolding events, assuming we don't start to move into wartime restrictions on media. Okay, so I guess what I want to do fairly briefly, if I can, today is just I guess make a couple of comments really about how I see this situation having arisen and what it kind of means for everyone trying to make sense of the world around them right now. And although I said it's kind of part of 100 Years' War, I think the root of this event in Ukraine really goes back. You need to look back over like a 30-year period since 1991, since the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Something which was celebrated, I guess, in the West, perhaps a little bit too cockily and a little bit too offensively, but led in Russia to what Vladimir Putin described as a geopolitical tragedy, something which people in, I guess, Anglo-American Western countries say, shows that he wants to sort of, re-establish the Russian Empire. But the fact is that the 1990s was a social catastrophe for Russia because the end of the Cold War led to, the disintegration of the political system and the application of economic shock therapy, and sort of extreme, neoliberal economic and other social policies being applied in a Russia which had totally different traditions. And it saw, the size of the economy in roughly 10 years dropped 40-50%, and there was enormous human tragedy. I mean, male life expectancy fell significantly in the 1990s. And there was a huge humiliation and shaming inflicted on Russia. And all the time there was a kind of, a clown as the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, a drunken clown, who was nonetheless very much propped up by America and celebrated in America and sort of indulged as the sort of the fool on the international stage, dancing on stage with Bill Clinton and all the rest of it. But he made many disastrous decisions which really led to a social catastrophe, and ever since Vladimir Putin succeeded Boris Yeltsin, really Russia's been going through like a 20-25 year phase of I think what you might call self-strengthening. Self-strengthening, I think, was a phrase used by Japan or Japanese elites, even maybe by some of the other sort of non-colonial states in the late 19th century to describe the sort of rebuilding of economic sort of self-sufficiency, the rebuilding of social and political institutions. And despite all the, labels applied to the current Russian regime in the popular media, even in the elite media, you need to sort of look behind those, look behind sort of sensational stories and look at the broader reality of what is happening in Russia, or what has happened in Russia over the last 30 years, not naively and not propagandistically, but also realize that, one of the world's great cultures had endured a profound shaming, humiliation, and received incredibly bad advice from Western democratic nations, and was also deceived about the sort of, peaceful intentions of America and its NATO allies in terms of eastward expansion of NATO. And that's the other key thing. So in the 1990s, as part of the dissolution sort of process around this, or the end of the Berlin Wall, America promised to Russia that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. And even in the last week or so, documents have emerged from diplomatic archives in I think Germany and in the United Kingdom, which demonstrate that this was a known fact and a known position of all the sort of Western powers, and they've kind of been lying about it ever since. So this whole thing, the whole question of Ukraine joining NATO, has been a conflict that's been rising to a crescendo, not in the last few days by some madman in the Kremlin who is no longer a rational actor. And I've heard otherwise sensible people on American sort of commentary say such ridiculous things, but it's a fundamental diplomatic geostrategic conflict where, to be frank, America and NATO are in the wrong. That has been brewing for 30 years. So that's one. So this is really the culmination of a 30-year political cycle, and this is also where I say that the Cold War ended without a negotiated peace with Russia. In Russian eyes, it's not quite like the Treaty of Versailles, but there was a kind of diplomatic and cultural sort of form of a Treaty of Versailles inflicted on the country, in which there was massive loss and dislocation, and there has been subsequent desire to both restore status and strength and pride, and that can take extreme forms in nationalism, but it can also take simple, clear and assertive forms. And because there was no fairly negotiated peace, that is effectively what 3 or 4 months ago was being proposed by Russia in its proposed treaties with NATO and America. It was, okay, the Cold War's over. We don't need these two warring. The Warsaw Pact has been closed, but the NATO Pact that is targeting Russia and is expanding, and that defines Russia as the enemy, and it has been expanding all the way to its borders and has, nuclear warheads pointed at Russia, is not the way to guarantee the security of the West Eurasian Peninsula. That includes both European Russia and the rest of Europe, including Ukraine. Okay, so that's my sort of thoughts on really and this is the fundamental issue that is at the heart of this dispute. And without seriously addressing that, it will not be solved. And at the moment, it is being solved through force, but I suspect that force will come to a conclusion reasonably quickly. That the current Ukrainian government will capitulate or surrender, or be forced to surrender, with more or less loss of life, depending on how much they sort of go, sort of downfall mode. But after that, I feel the world will require, assuming America and EU, and regrettably, I must say, the Australian government go full crazed warmonger, then it will then fundamentally lead to a peace agreement to see a new security arrangement in Europe, and I suspect before too long also a new security arrangement in the Western Pacific. So I really do feel the Australian government needs to cool its head and think about the long-term history, and give peace a chance. Give peace and security in Europe a chance, and negotiate with Russia about its legitimate security interests, and stop all this hysterical nonsense about, all this sort of Russophobic, frankly, bordering on ethnically prejudiced scaremongering. And the fact is, we have models we can use to take a different approach. For one, we could follow the example of India and its extremely capable External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. J. Shankar. I apologise, I don't know what the S stands for. He has been Foreign Secretary before. He's been the ambassador to the United States. He's been the ambassador to China, the High Commissioner to Singapore, and the ambassador to the Czech Republic. And he's currently the External Affairs Minister for India, and He has led with clarity and real professional diplomacy a sort of a neutral position that de facto has been supportive of Russia and China's requests for there to be real diplomatic talks about Russia's legitimate security concerns. And if you want, there was a brilliant sort of panel session featuring Dr. Jaishankar at the Munich Security Dialogue about a week or so ago, which Australia's Foreign Minister also attended. And there was much more interest in what Dr. Jaishankar had to say, I think, and rightly so. So Australia is a member of the Quad, as is India, and I feel if Dr. Jaishankar and Maurice Payne actually sort of had a bit more voice, and if Ms. Maurice Payne spoke more with Dr. Jaishankar, we could perhaps maybe persuade America and the United Kingdom to come to their senses, but we shall see. Now, the other thing here is, and it circulated a little bit on social media during the week, was a speech by former Prime Minister Paul Keating in 1997, which was approximately a year or so after he left office. And it was a speech expressing concern about the then approach of the EU and NATO to expand eastward. That was sort of, picking up speed under sort of Bill Clinton and Bill Clinton's successor, whoever that was, George W. Bush. I think it was Bill Clinton's successor. Maybe not. Can't remember when Bill Clinton left office. But let me just read from this speech from 1997. So Paul Keating says, partly as a result of the reluctance of current members to move faster in expanding EU membership, I believe a great security mistake is being made in Europe with the decision to expand NATO. There is no doubt this was seen by some in Europe as a softer option than EU expansion. NATO and the Atlantic Alliance served the cause of Western security well. They helped ensure that the Cold War finally ended in ways which serve open democratic interests. But NATO is the wrong institution to perform the job it is now being asked to perform. The decision to expand NATO by inviting Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic to participate and to hold out the prospect to others, in other words, to move Europe's military demarcation point to the very borders of the former Soviet Union, is, I believe, an error which may rank in the end with the strategic miscalculations which prevented Germany from taking its full place in the international system at the beginning of this century. The great question for Europe is no longer how to embed Germany in Europe. That has been achieved, but how to involve Russia in a way which secures the continent during the next century. I'm no great fan of Paul Keating, but he was absolutely right, and I urge Australia's political leaders to read that speech and to reconsider the approach we are taking to the current global security crisis. All right, so look, I was going to say a little bit more about how things have, the other sort of broad events that one needs to understand. To understand what's happening at the moment. First of those is the the change in government in 2014 in Ukraine, which led to a United States-sponsored government that started the move, accelerated the move to NATO and to the EU, and which has, I guess, created a sort of a diplomatic and security time bomb on Russia's doorstep. There are very conflicted views around that 2014 coup, and I don't really feel quite ready, or that the 2014 events in the Ukraine, and I don't quite feel ready at this point to talk about that. But that is a fundamental sort of thing, and you cannot understand Russia's intentions or its actions without understanding its belief that that was an engineered coup that has led to a sort of a regime in Ukraine that claims to be democratic while conducting a civil war against the Donetsk and Lugansk republics, and in Russia's view and the view of many external observers, jailing opposition leaders, closing down opposition and Russian language media outlets, having a legal ban on the use of Russian, banning the use of Russian language from schools and things like this. So if that is a democracy, I think people need to sort of perhaps check some of their rhetoric. And then obviously the last 3 to 4 months are really the kind of thing that I was flagging in that earlier podcast towards the end of last year, which was Russia's treaty proposals. And since December, despite Russia's repeated requests to have those taken seriously, they have not been taken seriously. Please, you will read in the media that this was an unprovoked attack, but from my podcast that there was a set of, I guess, peace proposals put on the table which related to fundamental principles that for whatever reason America and NATO have treated with contempt. And that is a key part of the background of the events. Events are moving very, very quickly in Ukraine, and it appears to me, having watched some of the discussion in the media, that there has been an extraordinarily swift and effective military operation performed by Russia, which will likely achieve its objectives within days. And but I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because events change, things go wrong, things go right, hard to know. If you're interested, I would highly recommend checking out the Russians with Attitude podcast. They are providing extraordinary kind of on-the-ground coverage of events in Ukraine, as well as they've done a couple of podcasts now around the situation. And if you listen into that, it's, I guess, done from a kind of a Russian perspective, but a very, very knowledgeable Russian perspective, and you will get a good understanding of things. And also maybe check out some of the writing or appearances on, YouTube or whatever, of Scott Ritter, who was formerly the sort of advisor to Norman Schwarzkopf during the first Gulf War in the early 1990s, and I think was then also like part of the inspections regime for the, like in the war against, before the sort of weapons of mass destruction. Last case of America making all sorts of, questionable claims before the Security Council of the United Nations. So, there's been an extraordinary attack, which has been quite precise, has not been particularly targeted at civilians, has largely wiped out a lot of the Ukrainian sort of military infrastructure, and now Ukraine is sort of handing out Kalashnikov rifles and grenades and that sort of thing to untrained citizens, and things I think are going to maybe be a bit dire and ugly in the last couple of days of this, which is a human tragedy, but we might comment upon that in a subsequent podcast when things are a bit clearer. Okay, the last thing I really wanted to say is just also emphasize that this is a full spectrum war. There is a military side of that. There is an economic side of that. And there is the sort of information war side of that. I've seen ministers of the Australian government say that, it's like the internet should remove the president of Russia's website. That kind of thing. People are being accused of treason and blah, 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 blah. All that kind of thing. I just would urge everyone to be really careful in interpreting the kind of information they're seeing in the media, to be open-minded about things and curious, and to remember that just to remember that the first victim of war is truth, the first casualty of war is truth, and that the lesson perhaps of the Soviet Union and of the Iraq war and of the Afghanistan war is that many of the people who express dissent about the stories propagated with enthusiastic certainty by Western governments and Western media proved correct. And in that regard, I read an article by Paul Kingsnorth during the week on, I think it was on the unheard.com website. Originally he produces like a Substack, which he then often republishes at least excerpts from. And in that essay called "The Liberal Order is Already Dead," Paul Kingsnorth, and this was early in the week before the dramatic events of February the 24th, particularly in the context of the Canadian emergency order that was, used to clear protesters and to sort of freeze their bank accounts and all that kind of thing. In that article, he said that as extreme individualism deepens and an all-powerful state intervenes ever more deeply and widely to manage the resulting fragmentation, Western democracies show every sign of transforming openly into authoritarian oligarchies in which dissent, especially dissent aimed at liberalism itself, is ruthlessly suppressed by politicians who claim to represent the people. So there you go, and that was before there was a war involving America on one side and China and Russia on the other. So be very careful, take care of yourself, and I will comment a little bit more on this whole situation, which hopefully doesn't develop into World War III in a week or two. In the meantime, my next podcast is going to be on happier topics of games and gaming and play in history. Now, just for the sake of speed of issuing, I'm not going to do my usual editing on this podcast, so I do apologise if there are a few too many ums and ahs in it all, but I think you'll see. I guess I've left that in partly because it just reflects the uncertainty of the situation and my sort of response to it. So I hope you all respect that, and I hope you have a wonderful week. And in the meantime, and perhaps more so than ever, do remember this, that what thou lovest